she tells it. Oh, thanks. Yeah, this meeting's being recorded as well. Jerry's recording the meeting so that we can put it on our website. And there are a number of folks that aren't able to join us but wanted to. So they'll be able to see it as well, but we'll let you know where it is on the website. Noreen, Noreen's a radio amateur, first of all. She's a VE3 AQZ. And there's quite a backstory there, but I won't go into that. She says that she's been working for Hammond for the past 49 years. And so she's very, very familiar with both the Hammond organization and as the curator of the museum. This really is all her work. She claims she has never met a piece of paper that she doesn't like. And one of her hobbies is reading and playing the piano. Reading, and is her passion is the museum, and you're going to see that in this presentation. She is very passionate about vintage radio in all its forms, and is quite an expert in the cross section of vintage radio. So with that, I'm gonna bow out, turn it over to Noreen. Noreen, it's all yours.
Thank you, Gary. Hello, everyone. Before I go to the presentation, I'd just like to introduce you to Philip Taylor. He's a museum volunteer, one of our longest distance volunteers visiting from England. And I'll let Philip introduce himself, and then I will go on with the presentation.
Yes, hi everybody. I'm visiting from England, as Noreen says. I'm an ex-Marine radio officer, radio electronics officer. And from the hobby point of view, I have a particular interest in tubes, aka valves. My collection starts from 1905 and goes through to the 1930s. I also have an interest in so-called classic hi-fi, which is equipment from the 1950s in general, and shortwave TRFs. So that's a little bit of background there. I've been coming to the Hammond Museum for 3 or 4 years now, fixing the odd thing, going through the valves, of which the Hammond Museum owns a great many, some of which are not really that important. So we are trying to fish out the really interesting ones and succeeding quite well so far.
Okay, we'll hear from Philip as we get towards the end of the presentation. He'll talk about some of our special tubes in the museum. So away we go. So, welcome to the Hammond Museum of Radio. The Hammond Museum of Radio is located in a 4,400 square foot gray metal addition to the Hammond Power Solutions transformer plant in the south end of the city of Guelph. We're about 10 minutes from the 401 corridor, which is the major highway traveling east to west across southern part of Ontario. One of the reasons for locating it to this area is the fact that it gives us the ability to keep everything on one level. We have accessibility for all levels of people with wheelchairs and walkers and seeing eye dogs. And we can also take the heavy equipment because it's all ground level. This is the entrance to the museum. So when you enter into the museum, you can stand at the front and look out across the whole area. the sections are labeled up above with what area each of the exhibits is for. So you can see military at the back and amateur. So if you don't want to sort of take it in chronological order, you can pick your favorite section and race right to it to see it. This is also at the front of the museum. This is what I like to call the curator's selection. So my favorite radios, because curators can have their favorites too. And I'll talk a little bit about the Mercury Super 10, which is this one here, and the Canadian a little bit later. This is a Heigl, another Canadian made radio. Then a couple of chairside radios, Zenith and Stromberg Carlson, and the big McMurdo Silver, which has been Philip's restoration project for the last 3 years. And finished it last year on his visit and is now fully operational. When we brought it out of the old museum and into the location at Southgate Drive, it wouldn't work any longer. So it's now back to its wonderful sounding self. And Philip knew he had done what needed to be done when one of the accounting people raced out and crabbed at him because he was running the radio too loud and they couldn't work. So that's when he knew that his work was done on the McMurdo Silver. So the history, we have to look at the museum as the history of both the Hammond corporations as well as the Hammond family. So Oliver Shervill Hammond, which is all these boys' father, moved into the area in the late 1800s and located in an area of Guelph that was close to the university. And Oliver was an inventor, and he designed equipment for the foundry industries at that time. He designed couplings for streetcars. And he also designed a beehive, which the University of Guelph in its agricultural department obtained the patent for and took over these beehives because they had quite a collection of beehives at the university. So Oliver had 6 boys and 2 girls, and they're depicted left to right as Len and Roy and Fred, Ken, and Gordon, and then Donald. So the boys used to walk along the railroad tracks and pick up pieces of coal and do whatever they could to make a few pennies to buy magazines and learn about all the new technology. So the 4 oldest ones, Len, Fred, Roy, and Ken, are the founding members of Hammond Manufacturing. So Oliver and his oldest son, Len, formed the company in 1917 as O.S. Hammond and Son. And then 10 years later, in 1927, it was moved to become Hammond Manufacturing Company Limited. So have been proud to work for a family-owned business that's still family-owned and still in business, and celebrating over 100 years in business. And the Hammond family is shown with their 100,000th transformer. And for somebody who's going to ask me what the year of this is, I forget. I'm thinking the 60s something. I thought it was 1971 at one point. So if anyone is interested, I will research that. And this was a transformer that was built for Atomic Energy of Canada in association with the University of Western Ontario. And this is a cancer research piece of equipment. In the very early days, all the work for the company was done in the parlor of the family home. So really didn't move to a building until the mid-20s. So the company actually started making radios in the early 1920s, and it made 3 or 4 different models. This was the final model. This was the Model 12. And the family would take it out on the front lawn of the company home and invite the citizens of Guelph to come and listen to the new technology. And people would walk or ride their bike, or if they could afford to, they would take a streetcar to the end of the city and walk the rest of the way. And they would all sit on the front lawn and hear this new technology. So a lot of things were going on at the time with Westinghouse and General Electric and RCA pooling their patents. And the company took a hard look at thinking, well, if they continued on in radio, although this was an original design by Len Hammond, they felt that perhaps it was not the best business model for them to continue with. And so they moved out of radio and they started to make parts for radios and different radio equipment. So they made antenna direction finders. They made, this is the Wellington 7 amplifier. This is also an amplifier which was used in schools. You could take your battery to the company, and for, I believe it was 50 cents, you could get it charged at the company. And they also went into a line of battery eliminators, as well as early audio transformers and resistors. These are examples of the very early transformers. I love to see the kind of colorful logos that that they used. Now, you know, it's like you take 3 letters and you go HPS and or BMO for Bank of Montreal, and you shorten it as fast as much as possible. But love these old-fashioned logos and old way of boxes and things like that. Fred Hammond, call sign VE3HC. Fred was the one of the co-founders of Hammond Manufacturing, but also the founder of the Hammond Museum of Radio. So at one time it would have been his private collection completely, and now perhaps about 70% his private collection, and 30, maybe even 40% now donations. So Fred started building radios when he was 11 years of age, and he started collecting them probably in his late 20s and early 30s. Often people would bring them to him, and if they didn't want the equipment, and give them to him, and he was actively acquiring them during that time. One comment I just want to make about the Hammond family, the boys, the four boys. When I started with the company in 1972, I had the opportunity of working with each of them. And except for Ken Hammond, these men were not formally educated. Most of them finished at grade 11 and went to work right away. Len Hammond having to become the head of the family and make sure the family was fed and everything. But they had that natural ability to design things and build things just out of their heads. And Fred Hammond building most of the Hammond amplifiers just from what was in his head. Len Hammond would design transformers on whatever he had available at the time. It could be a placemat, it was a napkin, and I remember one day he brought his shirt into the engineering department, and on the sleeve of his shirt he had scribbled the design of a transformer and gave it to the engineer and said, here, make this into something that the plant can build it from. Just that incredible natural ability to make and design. It was fascinating just to be part of that. So the museum became a registered charity in 1983. It's government registered. So the assets are, it's important that the assets now are protected for future generations. So my job as curator is simply to make sure that everything is done as possible to keep the assets protected. The museum is set up in chronological order. So we start very early with a selection of keys and relays and sounders used by Morse telegraphers for the railroad stations, Western Union, the press. The Prince Albert tobacco can. The only item that has ever been stolen from the museum is the Prince Albert tobacco can. I have no idea why. You can get them very easily in antique places for about $5. Somehow somebody took a liking to it, maybe thought it was still full of tobacco. I don't know. So just to talk about what this can was used for. So in a group of railroad telegraphers that would get to, like say worked for Canadian National Railway, in the office there, or in the office area, there may be 20 or 25 telegraphers all operating this kind of equipment and all listening to sounders and information coming in, and then translating it into the written word. So in order to get a sound where they could listen to something specifically that was their own, they would squash the Prince Albert can in behind the sounder, and depending on where you put it and where you put the dents in it and how you opened it or closed it or everything, the sounder took on a different tone. So it really was quite fascinating just to hear the different, and that way they could isolate one sound out of 25 others. So it's very clever. I also hear that the tobacco was the best pipe tobacco you could buy. Very early wireless, starting at the front of the museum. I'll talk a little bit later about the spark transmitter and a couple of the other items. So this is also Marconi, and we'll touch a little bit on Marconi a little bit later in the presentation. Northern Electric. So Paragon, Omega. This is a piece of Marconi. It's a Model C and it's a battery box. So the battery would have gone in the bottom of the box. Western Electric amplifier, just some very early wireless. Canadian Independent Telephone, Crystal Radios, Canadian General Electric. We have the Quaker Oats radio. This was made by one of the volunteers. But as an example of a radio, Quaker Oats had just created Quaker Oats in 1921 and was looking for a marketing gimmick. So for a box, 2 box tops, $1, and you would get one of these Quaker Oats crystal radios. So you got 100 feet of antenna, you got a grounding cable, you got a set of headphones, and you got the crystal radio. 250,000 of these crystal radios went into homes in 1921. This one here is operational. We have the broadcast of the local, one of the local radio stations here in Guelph is just across the street from the Hammond Expressway. So with a lot of patience, if you take this radio out on the sidewalk, you can actually get some sound out of the local radio station. Our selection of Atwater Kent, breadboards across the back, and then some of the metal and wooden piece radio at the front. This is just a variety of receiving and transmitting tubes, just a collection at the front, just so everybody can see all the different sizes and shapes of tubes. And then also at the front, we have our Ever Ready radios. This is the big one with the record player inside, and the small version of it. And then the Stromberg Carlson, which is currently on Philips list to repair. It's not working at the moment. And it is one of the ones we use a lot in the tours. Has 16 tubes, has an incredible sound. Speakers and microphones, different broadcast microphones. A lot of them were shock mounted, and then the button microphones. And then we have our broadcast section. So broadcast radios of the 1920s and 1930s and into the early 40s. A lot of them are made in the United States, a lot of different varieties. These ones here are cathedral radios. So the cathedral radio are a favorite among local theater groups. And if they have a sort of a vintage play that they're wanting a radio for, they'll come and ask to borrow a radio. And they don't want one that's in good condition. They like ones that are really quite worn and are well used. And in the background, I'm just going to talk a little bit for a minute about the Magnavox. So this is a Magnavox radio here. And Magnavox was started in 1917, and the Latin name means great voice. And they were very, very good with horns and speakers. Well, in 1924, they decided that they would make a radio as well. And this is the radio that they made. And all the works of the radio are inside a drawer. So this actually here is a drawer. And when you pull it open, you see the radio works in a drawer. So we figure that's where that phrase sort of was coined, works in a drawer. It's very, very interesting. They weren't as good at making radios as they were at speakers. And so they abandoned the manufacture of radios and did return to what they did best, and that was making speakers. Down in this table here, we have some of our rarer and more unique radios, and I apologize, I didn't take as good a picture of this as I should have. So we have World Globe, and we have some Addison, Bakelite radio and a matching speaker, some there's lamp radios, just a variety of unique radios. This particular radio here is the Westinghouse Column Air, and it was on display at the Canadian National Exhibition. So the speaker is in the top, and the controls are on the side of the radio. And I always like to remind people there's no snooze control on these radios. And then our collection of Rogers radios, Ted Rogers, who was also the founder of CFRB. And these are batteryless radios of the late 1920s. And here are pictures of the Rogers Majestic plant that was in downtown Toronto. Photograph of Guglielmo Marconi, 1901, which leads into our Marconi exhibit. This particular table is not always a Marconi exhibit. So at the moment it is not, but it will be shortly because I'm turning it back into the Marconi exhibit. People always seem to like to see this exhibit. And we use the table in case there are private collectors who want to exhibit their radios for maybe a period of about 6 months to 8 months. And then we'll set them up on this table and give them recognition for the radios that are on loan to the museum. Some collectors like to have their radios so that visitors can see them. And for now, we don't have any private collection on display at the moment, so we're going to put the table back in to a Marconi exhibit. So you can see very early Marconi here. These are receiver and amplifier 1922. I had to write down some of the years because sometimes I don't always remember the years. And then the Marconi 3 is here. And then this is the Marconi 6, and inside is a loop antenna inside the top of the cover. Absolutely beautiful radio. And these were all made by the Canadian Marconi Company in Montreal. And then the flagship piece in the museum is our 1901 Marconi Spark transmitter. This is similar to what was used on the Titanic, and we just call it Sparky for short. And Sparky spent a fair amount of time on the road at different places across Canada, but is getting harder to find somebody who will insure the radio while it's away, and also that will transport it as well. Last time we transported it, we used an independent trucker. So decision was made 2 years ago that the Spark transmitter would no longer leave the museum for other places. And that's just a close-up of the 1901 Spark transmitter. And this is made by the American Marconi Company. This one gets a lot of attention, and I have to write it down. It's a Marconi Crystal Sat Type 2846B with Paracon detector. So I don't know how, I've had at least 6 or 7 requests over the last year for photographs of this, including the nameplate. It's not an easy radio to photograph, but I've also had a request for the inside of this radio to be photographed, and we have not taken this. This has been in the museum for a very long time. We have never taken it apart. I'm actually kind of afraid to take it apart, but we're having a good look at it, and the decision on whether we'll take it apart or not is still undecided. The museum is a member of the Collins Collectors Association, and we have quite an extensive collection of Collins radio equipment. So this particular one, the KW1, we have 2 KW1s here, and they're matching 75A4s. And then we have 2 sets of Gold Dust twins. And the reason why they were called the Gold Dust twins was because they were very, very expensive. The amateur radio collection is the foundation of the Hammond Museum. So it's what started the museum, and we have radios that were used for commercial purposes as well as amateur radio. And so there's Patterson, there's Bretting, and then we have Hammerland and Helicrafters, and a collection of Heathkits. And a little story about the Heathkit. Fred Hammond always said that there was no place in the Hammond Museum for Heathkit equipment. So he never collected anything. So when I became the curator in 1999 and I was offered some Heathkit, I know a lot of people have used Heathkit, and it certainly plays an important part in the history of radio. But every time I put a piece of Heathkit into that museum, I always look over my shoulder and expect something bad to happen every time I put it in there. Now we're into the military section. This particular unit is the backup unit for the USS Missouri. And it was accepted by the Navy in 1944, but it didn't get placed into service. If the Missouri had have been torpedoed or the radio equipment damaged, then this equipment would have gone and taken its place. So here you can just barely see the power supply is about the same, about 3/4 the size of both of these pieces as well. So the US Navy was going to destroy it, but then called Mr. Hammond and asked if he'd be interested in having it in the museum. And he said he would. And so they said, well, maybe better send a truck to pick it up. The thing weighs a few thousand pounds. But then they decided that maybe they shouldn't have given it up. So they placed a call to Fred and wanted to know if he could send it back to them. And he just told them that they were welcome to come and visit it anytime they wanted to, because it had already crossed the border. So there was no way it was going back. It spent a long time in the lunchroom. We ate our lunch with this for many, many, many years before there was a museum that could support the weight of the radio's equipment. So in the racks here, we have just a variety of different racks used by the different military. So the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, and this particular unit was the US Coast Guard. And this got quite a bit of attention a few years ago because this Coast Guard radio is the same age of radio that Amelia Earhart had her last transmission going to a Coast Guard cutter, and they would have had the same sort of equipment aboard. So there was a special a hunt and a search going on, and it was considered to be top secret. So permission was granted for this radio to leave the museum while some members of this group that were going to go and look for Amelia Earhart's plane off of Howland Island. They wanted to study sort of all the mechanics, and it was way beyond my understanding. It was pages and pages of analysis done on the radio. And then a mini sub was sent down, one of the ones that they radio operate, I guess, and sent down how many thousand feet? 17,700 feet off of Howland Island. So we were kind of excited, hoping that perhaps this radio would have played a little bit of a part in locating Amelia Earhart's plane, but unfortunately nothing was found. In the military section, wireless 19 sat. This is in both English and Russian. And this was made in Canada for Russia for Lend-Lease. And then we have the SCR 65s, which is World War I transmitter used by, and before I get the wrong word,
the Royal Flying Corps.
The Royal Flying Corps, because I always say it's the Royal Air Force, and Philip corrects me every time. So the Royal Flying Corps, this would have been carried in the plane, and there's a tiny little code key on the bottom of it, and then they would send the location of the enemy forces back to the ground forces. And we have Racal transmitter, receiver, and we have Japanese walkie-talkies and Army walkie-talkies. Not a big selection of World War I and World War II military. Fred had donated a lot of the military equipment to the Kingston Communications Museum. But when the old museum was moving, we found all kinds of things under tables and in storage and that. So we have a small military area. 1154s, 1155s used in the Halifax and Lancaster bombers radio equipment. And these are our amateur radio stations. So VE3HC is Fred Hammond's call sign. and it's the control station for the museum. And his son, Rob Hammond, sponsors his call sign. And VE3BJ is the museum's own call sign. And this is our Collins collectors station. Just sort of the way some of the QSL cards have evolved over the years. So Fred Hammond's card started off very simply at one point. It was aeronautical mobile. Fred Hammond was a pilot as well. And then this particular card design was designed for the Museum of Radio. The antenna for operations, the station is a Cushcraft X7. This is our second antenna. We chose it because there's a lot of high winds in the south end of Guelph. And this antenna has been just the best antenna we've ever had. So it's up about 75 feet. And then from the 1950s, this was a collection from one single donor, and he donated all his transistor radios to the museum. Lots of fun novelty radios, including the smallest one, which is the size of a credit card. Our phonograph, Edison phonograph, still operational. So sometimes we'll wind it up and put one of the Edison discs on and play Harry Lauder's Rowan the Gloamin'. Beautiful sounding. This is where I say, I defy anything you make today to last over 100 years and still be operational. And then one of our Addisons. These Addisons came out of a barn, surprisingly, but were kept under a pile of straw in a crate and survived amazingly well. The Mercury Super 10, probably my favorite radio in the museum. This is the jewel case model. It had 10 peanut tubes, and it was designed by Charles Lowry for the H.M. Kipp Company of Toronto. And it was a kit, and you could get it assembled, but most of the time it came as a kit. And it has a variety of different kinds of cases, simple ones. There's a portable one as well. And then the Canadian, one of two models that were built by Langford Radio in London. So this is the one model, and I do know where that other model is. So I'm hoping someday that, we'll get the second one into the museum as well. And this is what the tubes, when we light them up, we like to light the tubes up, and every now and then, and this is what, this is a recent one that we took. And our newest acquisition, and this was one that was acquired in England by Philip for the museum. And I'm going to turn it over to Philip just to have to talk a little bit about the Marconi Mark III.
Right, this was a receiver made to receive the spark transmitters that you've previously seen. So it was an air-to-ground system, no reverse direction, and it is an exceedingly elaborate crystal radio. It came with a pocket watch, which in this example of the radio is still present. Most, they would go missing when they were sold after World War I because they were a separate item. It had a variety of spare crystal detectors, which I think are under the wrapping to the left. It has a biased Perican detector, so there's a battery in the compartment below the plastic wrapping that you see, and there's a potentiometer to adjust the bias on the detector, and there's also a choice of other detectors. So it's exceedingly elaborate. They can be made to work. Everything needs cleaning. So they are very interesting. They have quite a wide range, a lot of taps on the coil and tuning arrangements. They were quite common when we first started the Vintage Wireless Society. They're increasingly rare now. And to have an example which is as complete as this and in such excellent condition is now a rarity. So overall, it's a very interesting radio. We've been sorting out the various tubes in the collection. At home, there's a general agreement that they can be split into two categories. That's pre-World War I, World War I era, and early broadcast. So these will be pre-broadcast and pre-World War I. The tube on the left is a Fleming diode from about 1905. This was a commercial diode used in a Marconi wireless telegraph receiver of the period. This is interesting. Most Fleming diodes have nothing written on them, but this has Fleming oscillation valve, which was what the devices were called, and it's got the Royal Ediswan brand. Now, Ediswan is obviously a combination of Edison from the USA and Swan, who was an English lamp inventor, and they were early manufacturers in England of Fleming diodes. They were crabbed at by the Royal Warrant people because the Royal prefix should only be used for lamps at the time. So they had to take that off. I don't know whether this diode is operational. I have one, and I put it on my valve tester to everybody's horror, but I said, it's a diode, it's got a filament, we need to check the vacuum. And sure enough, it worked exactly as it should. Now, the next valve along is a replica Fleming diode. It's called a gallows diode because of the wooden mounting. It's dated 1907, but it is a replica. And it's believed to be one of Phil Weingarten's replicas. He was active, I believe, in New York in the 60s and 70s. And he was a first-class craftsman with both glass, metal, and wood. And this is one of his products. The only snag is that he didn't label them as replicas. And if he was questioned about this, apparently he had a rather nasty temper. We believe that the diodes like this were made more for educational purposes because of the way it's constructed and the fact that it has binding posts on it, so you can connect it up and demonstrate its action. The third tube from the left is a unique one. The design, I think, is based on the Audiotron, which was one of DeForest's designs slightly later than the original spherical Audion, and these were made on the West Coast. It was a very coarse grid, which is quite close to the anode. The envelope is clearly from a lamp. And did we decide that it was a Fred Hammond idea?
We weren't, it would be a Len Hammond.
A Len Hammond, who had connections with the lamp company in Guelph at the time. And they made him up one of these, but I think the decision was taken that it was far too complex to get into the tube business. The tube on the right is also an Audiotron style design from Japan, circa 1920. There's very little known about the company that made it, which was Anaka. Gerald Tyne threw up his hands and said, we just don't know anything about this. We've tried contacting the Japanese trade mission, the Japanese broadcasting people, but they cannot find any background on this tube. So it is exceedingly uncommon. And how it ever got to Canada is not known. And it's also not known as to how the Japanese were obtaining Audiotrons to copy, which was their thing at the time. They buy two of everything, keep one, take one to bits, and build another one. So these have been picked out as examples of pre-broadcast tubes. And this is an ongoing project because I would like to pick out 1 or 2 World War I tubes, both American and British, and some very early broadcast tubes, which again will be American and British. I really don't know what the background is, but there were British tubes imported into Canada in the very early 20s, but I don't think this lasted very long. So that's an ongoing project, and hopefully in the years to come, subject to both of us remaining vertical, we'll progress that.
So that concludes the museum presentation. And I will open it up to everyone or anyone for questions. And Gary's going to moderate this. I can't hear anyone.
I just found that presentation very, very interesting. A lot of this gear goes back to my early days, and I could recognize a lot of the pieces from the Hammond collection. Thank you very much.
You're welcome, Doug.
I joined in late myself, and I'm going to watch it again because accordingly it's been recorded. So I will watch it in the full entirety. But looking at the picture right now, I'm wondering where they got the transformers from to light these tubes from.
Yeah, I'll just in the initial lighting of the tubes, we managed to knock the power out for the whole plant on that side. So what Philip has done is he has made it so that when we light the tubes, instead of choosing one power bar and then turning them all on at the same time, each one is individually turned on one at a time. And that way we don't run the same risk of knocking out all the power.
Yeah, it must draw a huge current.
Yeah, it does. They're on step-down transformers. But even saying that, they do draw a lot of current when you've got them all on.
Thank you.
I have a Hammond transformer here. I don't know how old it is. It's been sitting in a box since the 60s, I think. Happy to send it to you. And I think we dug you up a volunteer, Noreen. So I think we've got a volunteer that's going to help you out.
Oh, that would be great. Thanks, Dave. Yeah, I've been away for about 10 days. So somebody was looking at my emails and apparently someone has contacted me. I'll be back in the office tomorrow morning. So yes, a volunteer would be lovely and would really appreciate it. So thank you. Any other questions? Oh, good. This is good. I'm getting off easy.
Yeah, Noreen, I have one for you. You have a lot of Collins equipment on display. Why is that?
A part of it is that as a member of the Collins Collectors Association, we feel that we have a certain responsibility to acquire the Collins equipment as it becomes available. It's also part of the mandate of the museum that Collins equipment we will collect. And then all the registration numbers are registered with the Collectors Association so that they know exactly where who's got what pieces and what their serial numbers are and all of that. It's a bit of a double-edged sword because I find that it's more modern Collins, if you want to use the word modern, equipment that's now becoming available, whereas I think we'd like to have a little bit more of the older items. And possibly that's a bit of a lack on our part in identifying or putting a year on it. So I think we need to revise our mandate and say Collins equipment from certain years only.
Yes, thank you. Any other questions for Noreen? I see in the chat room there are a number of texts in chat. So if you're interested, the bottom of your screen there's a chat icon, and you can have a look at those. Most of them say pretty much the same thing, which is a wonderful presentation, Noreen. I think everyone thoroughly enjoyed it. And is there some way that people can get in touch with you directly if they have further questions and comments about the museum?
Sure. The website, the link is to the curator, but if I give you my direct email for Hammond Manufacturing, that just comes directly to my desk. And when I'm at my desk, I read my emails pretty much regularly every day, whereas the one that comes through the website takes a little bit longer to route to me. So that email is N Irwin, so N-I for India, R for Robert, W-I-N at H-A-M for ham, radio operator, MFG, short for manufacturing. So HAMMFG.com. And then phone number for the head office of Hammond Manufacturing is 519-822-2960. And my extension is 1252.
And we'll see this presentation on the CVRS website as well. So anyone that missed it or would like to see it again, we'll send out a notice, so it'll be on the homepage of the website as well.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Other questions for Noreen before we leave?
This presentation very interesting because I'm in the process of divesting of some of my collection, which was out of the broadcast industry, the commercial broadcast industry. And so this was particularly interesting to see a good museum, because I've been just as of yesterday started with the Alberta Provincial Archives to place some of my broadcast gear there. So thank you very much for the presentation. That was great.
You're welcome.
I just wanted to add my kudos. That was a wonderful presentation.
Thank you, Keith. Thank you. Thank you all.
Well, if there are no other questions, Jerry, can I turn this back to you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I've got my mic back on. I'll just stop recording now.